It was former President Ronald Reagan who once said, government doesn't solve problems, it subsidizes them. And as the government, we believe that we shouldn't be increasing programs funding when they don't need it. It's generally good to keep government spending low. And the philosophy of the negative team is that PEPFAR is working perfectly fine right now, and so there's no need to increase funding. And to prove that, I'm going to be going over Benjamin's first speech in his 1AC where he laid out the initial plan for the affirmative team. Let's first discuss their second inherency argument. Here they said that PEPFAR had funding issues. I have two responses here. The first is that PEPFAR denies. Again, PEPFAR denies. Now, Eleanor in her last speech sort of said, well, just because they didn't ask for more funding doesn't mean that they don't need more funding. And what she's sort of implying here is that there's this sort of dance going on. It's kind of like, to use an example from high school, you want to ask a girl to a dance, and the girl's like, well, I'm not saying you should ask me, but I'm not saying you shouldn't not ask me. And there's the issue here is that government programs don't work like that. There's a clearly outlined process here that my partner referred to within his speech. There's this entire process that agencies go through to request more funding. That option has been available for PEPFAR, but they haven't taken that option. And the implications are huge for a couple of reasons. The first is the second response to their second inherency argument. You can write this one down as what gets expanded. Again, what gets expanded. Because if PEPFAR isn't currently requesting funding, then we can assume that they don't have a game plan right now for additional funding. So we're just going to be unloading this increased funding on them, and we have no idea what they're actually going to do with it. And they have no plan for the funding right now. Meaning that these analyses brought up by the study, the peer-reviewed study that they keep on discussing, we don't know if what PEPFAR does with that money is going to be the same as what the study would have done with that money, which is the issue here and why their numbers don't hold up. But before I discuss that a little bit more in depth, I want to go over their plan, specifically the funding of their plan. The entire basis of their plan is to fund another program. The entire basis is the $700 million. So that $700 million is kind of important. So you can tag my response as unobligated balances have uses. Again, unobligated balances have uses. Let's look to the Government Publishing Office in November in 2018. Quote, unobligated balances refers to the balances that have not yet been committed by contract or other legally binding action by the government. Obligated balances refers to the balances where there have been legally binding action, but for which payment has not been yet made, but will be required in the future. Definition of unobligated funds is appropriated but remain uncommitted by contract at the end of a fiscal period. So here's what's important here. We're giving this money to these agencies, and some of that is unobligated balances. Now, what unobligated balances is referring to is just saying that the agency hasn't entered into a contract that requires that funding yet. So this isn't legally obligated money to any agency yet. That does not, however, mean that this money is just free and can be used for anything. Each agency has a budget and has plans for that budget. They have plans for what they want to do with that money. And they could be setting up more contracts in the future with their yearly appropriated budget. The impact is that we don't actually know what this $700 million is cutting, because that $700 million has been committed to some agency, and that agency has plans for that money. They just haven't entered a legal contract with that money yet. As a result, their plan could have massive unintended consequences. We could cut something that's incredibly crucial, like perhaps healthcare in a certain country or a certain state or something like that. The point being, we don't know what happens with the affirmative plan because we're drawing funding from places that actually need that funding. I think I've ranted enough about that, so let's move down to their two justifications. Specifically, let's look at their first subpoint of the first justification. Here, they discuss the empirical success. You can tag my response as doesn't deal with increases. Again, doesn't deal with increases. Now, the argument here under this justification subpoint was simply that PEPFAR is doing well. In the past, they've done good things. But the affirmative team isn't putting into place another PEPFAR. They're increasing PEPFAR's funding. So in order for them to prove their case empirically, what they have to do is look at past PEPFAR funding increases and see the impact that those funding increases had on PEPFAR and had on the initiatives that PEPFAR is carrying out. So this is an empirical evidence in support of their plan. But let's discuss their subpoint B of future solvency a little more, because this is kind of, the big deal within this round. 3 responses. First is no game plan. Again, no game plan. Cross-apply the analysis that I already provided under Inherency 2 about the fact that PEPFAR does not have a plan for the money that we're giving them, and so as a result, we don't necessarily know what it's going to be spent on. That leads me to my second response: what gets expended, or what gets expended. So basically, what specifically, because they discuss the different programs that PEPFAR participates in and funds. So what specifically gets expanded? Because I promise you, if you just take this money and fund a random program, you're not going to get the same results that that peer review study was looking at. And we don't actually know if PEPFAR participated in this peer review study. So this peer review study obviously took this additional funding and said, okay, this is what we would do with this funding, and that would be the results of us doing this with that funding. We don't know if PEPFAR will be doing the same things with that funding, so we can't look at their statistics and take them into account as fact within this debate round. Third response is that the countries are controlled. Again, the countries are controlled. This is just referencing the evidence that my partners already read from the State Department, saying that with the US government support and through our collaboration with many partners, several African countries are on pace to control their HIV/AIDS epidemic by 2020. Many more PEPFAR-supported countries are within reach of achieving epidemic control by 2020. So under PEPFAR's current funding level, more and more African countries are trending towards being independent and not having to deal with HIV and AIDS epidemics anymore. The current system, with the current level of funding, is working fine and doing precisely what the affirmative plan wants to do. Finally, let's discuss their second justification, that of development. I'm going to have three responses here. The first is unquantifiable. Again, my first response is unquantifiable. To prove this, all we have to do is look back to my cross-ex of Benjamin, where I asked him whether or not we could quantify these benefits of the social and diplomatic advantages of PEPFAR, and he couldn't do that for you. So we don't actually know how much these things will increase. To quote Ben himself, this advantage is a bit more idealistic. However, that leads me to my second response. Fails burden of proof. Again, fails burden of proof. Because in order to prove the resolution true, the affirmative team has to prove that their plan is beneficial. In order to prove that their plan is beneficial, they have to prove that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So the major disadvantage here, the biggest one right now, or the clearest one, is this increase $700 million. So that's a cold, hard number that we can look at. So we weigh $700 million, but we weigh it against something that's unquantifiable and, according to Ben, idealistic. You can't make that comparison, so this justification doesn't actually prove anything within this debate round. So if we actually look at this round and take a step back, we find that PEPFAR doesn't have a game plan for this funding, meaning that we don't know what it's going to do with this funding, meaning that we don't know the impacts of the affirmative plan. That's why I ask you to reject